Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for New American Security and our event on developing a transatlantic technology strategy. I'm Martin Rasser. I'm director of the Technology and National Security Program here at the Center. We're reminded daily how the world's leading powers are engaged in an unprecedented technology competition. The United States and Europe must compete together or risk ceding the competition to autocracies. They must be guided by a strategy that matches the moment. CNES recently issued a report called Lighting the Path, which frames the contours of such a transatlantic technology strategy. It's the culmination of a year of research, roundtables, and interviews, and I encourage you all to check it out. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll delve into the transatlantic technology relationship with noted experts. First, we'll hear from government officials from the European Union and the United States, Gerard de Graaf and Ruth Berry. Then I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Carissa Nietzsche and Hannah Kelly for the second segment, a panel discussion with Fran Burwell and Meg Harden. I've asked Gerard and Ruth to provide some opening remarks, after which we'll engage in a discussion. You'll have the opportunity to join the discussion as well. You can tweet your question with the hashtag CNES2022, or you can use the Submit a Question feature if you're on the webpage cnes.org/live. So our first guest is Gerard de Graaf. Gerard is Senior Envoy for Digital, is Senior EU Envoy for Digital, I should say, and head of the new EU office in San Francisco. He's worked for more than 30 years in the European Commission across a wide range of policy areas. Until his recent appointment, he was a director in DG Connect, responsible for the Digital Services and Digital Markets Acts. He's also been co-chairing two of the Trade and Technology Council working groups on green tech and on data governance and technology platforms. Gerard, welcome to CNAS.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning or wherever you are. And congratulations on your excellent Dutch pronunciation of my name.
Oh, thank you. Well, I try and bring out my Dutch language skills whenever I can. So it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce you. And with that, let me turn the floor over to you for some framing remarks.
Yeah, just maybe a few opening remarks. And I think what is important is to understand the situation in Europe at the moment. We have been living, of course, like the United States, through more than 2 years of the COVID pandemic. And then when we all thought things were looking up, we were faced with the Russian aggression and the invasion of Ukraine. We're living in a very difficult period in Europe where people are asking themselves and politicians are asking themselves the question, how are we going to get through the winter? If I take myself, before I came, I paid about $1,400 for energy to heat my house. Last year I paid $14,000 to heat my house. The cost of energy have skyrocketed in Europe by 10 times, and this is causing a major strain, not just on our economies, but on, say, the situation and the well-being of our people, and the need also to maintain stability. So that's the backdrop, and of course on top of that we are facing a serious economic downturn globally, but also certainly in Europe, and that is all coming together and making it very, very difficult, of course, to govern and to find solutions. This I think it's useful to sketch this as a background, because the issues which we are discussing today, technological kind of development, cooperation, of course, need to be seen in that context. And what at least these kind of the last couple of years have done is have accelerated and exposed very much kind of the need for the digital transformation, but also the vulnerabilities and the dependencies. And again, Europe has been feeling those dependencies quite directly over the last few years. So what I think now we're seeing in terms of like what is important is we need to invest much more in technologies. We need to kind of get our act together in the European Union at a time when it is more difficult to invest, because we're not having the kind of fiscal space that we had before, and at a time when, of course, the major preoccupation is in terms of the kind of the security situation in Europe and the energy crisis that we are facing. Maybe turning now to the US, I think we've rediscovered each other. It's been difficult under the previous administration to work together. I think with the Biden administration, the relationship is very constructive, very positive. We have very good discussions and cooperation through the Trade and Technology Council, and we are seeing the first results of that cooperation. And I think, as your report points out, and I'd very much like to welcome the report and the recommendations, it is absolutely critical that the EU and the US stand together, because not just economically, but our systems, our values, our democracies are at risk in this world where kind of certain regimes are clearly pursuing a very different vision of the world than the shared vision that the EU and the US stand for. So what should we do? How can we best manage this kind of difficult world together? I mean, first of all, we should coordinate as much as possible. This is what we're doing in the Trade and Technology Council. We're trying to set priorities. We're trying to kind of achieve concrete and tangible results. And I think we have already achieved quite a bit. I mean, in terms of export controls, for example, a fully harmonized system, particularly towards Russia, and also very strong cooperation in terms of export controls towards China. In terms of standards, international standards policy, a lot of cooperation. It was, I think, quite positive that the new leadership in the ITU, US kind of Secretary General, an EU Deputy Secretary General, that certainly was also the result of very close cooperation between the EU and the US, and of course with like-minded partners. We're working very closely on AI, very closely on quantum computing, on addressing disinformation. There's a whole list of issues on which cooperation has never been more intensive between the EU and the US, but we have further to go. I think what we need to realize is that kind of we are competing, our companies are competing, and that's good, but we need to kind of cooperate where we can. And sometimes that's a bit hard, because our policies are not necessarily the same. There are a few trade irritants, and we got to manage those. I think with data protection, the privacy shield, for example, a very positive development in the form of the executive order that President Biden signed a week and a half ago, and that paved the way for hopefully a positive adequacy finding in the next 6 months, which would, I think, be a relief to many industries and in the EU and in the US. The DSA and the DMA, you mentioned that in the introduction. Those were files that I was responsible for. I think the good thing is, through the TTC, we have a very shared problem analysis, and we simply need to manage. We have different political systems, different also regulatory cultures, and so those differences between the EU, I think we have to manage. It takes time. We have to talk a lot. But I think so far also that is working rather well. I think maybe I should leave it here. I think we have no choice but to work together. We cannot afford in this world kind of for the EU and the US to take our own kind of paths. We have to walk together. There may be disagreements. There will be disagreements which we will have to manage, and whenever possible, I think just joining forces is the way to go in the near and in the medium and to the longer term future.
Well, that was excellent, Gerard. Yeah, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more about that need for coordination, and of course acknowledge that yes, we are also competing with each other, but it's a healthy and constructive cooperation. I really like that phrase you used, that we have rediscovered each other. I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think both sides of the Atlantic have recognized how cooperation and coordination is in our mutual interest, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the TTC in particular moves forward on these issues. So let me now bring Ruth Berry onto the virtual stage. So Ruth is Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Information and Communications Policy in the newly established Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the U.S. Department of State. Before taking on this role, she was the Director for International Digital Technology Policy at the National Security Council. So Ruth, I'd love to hear from you some initial thoughts, and then looking forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you to be here, and thank you to CNAS for putting on this event and your efforts to strengthen transatlantic cooperation. And very glad to be here on a panel with Gerard. We've worked very closely together on a number of TTC and related issues. So very glad to be here today. Um, as the events in Ukraine have reaffirmed, there are areas where we need to work together to coordinate our efforts and deliver results. And there isn't a closer and more reliable partner for the United States as Europe, and vice versa. As President Biden has said, Europe is a partner of first resort. And when it comes to, the issues that we're talking about today, we share a common goal to promote the values of freedom and democracy around the world. We see authoritarian states trying to use technology not as an opportunity to enhance the quality of life for their citizens, but rather as tools for surveillance, coercion, and control. And this results in unprecedented global technology competition, and in a view of the challenges that come with it is a strong and resilient transatlantic alliance. And the close and comprehensive cooperation between the EU and the United States allows us not only to help counter these authoritarian efforts, but also to increase the speed of innovation, lower the cost for development and economic growth, and provide for the foundations for long term global technological competitiveness on both sides of the Atlantic and with partners around the world. On the very practical level, we share common interests. We support competitive digital markets that enable and support innovation. We want to establish regulatory policies that are technology neutral and incorporate stakeholder input. We want to maintain and simplify the free flow of data across borders while ensuring strong privacy protection. And we want to protect intellectual property and national security while continuing to uphold multi stakeholder approaches to internet governance. And as discussed, one of the most significant forums of transatlantic cooperation is the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. And it offers an opportunity for the US and Europe to work together to safeguard the rules-based international order, to strengthen norms and institutions that reflect and uphold our values, particularly when it comes to areas around technology policy. As I said, this is the TTC is a crucial forum for coping with and addressing technological standard settings, promoting dialogue on climate and clean tech of the future, fostering security standards for ICT networks and services, and working to prevent the possible misuse of tech against online human rights defenders. It is also a forum for a working partnership on artificial intelligence. AI is an emerging issue that demands our attention, and the regulation of this technology and the norms of how it is used and deployed must strike a balance between protecting the rights and privacy of individuals while simultaneously avoiding negative outcomes such as stifled economic innovation and competition. And we work very closely with the European Commission and others to promote alignment between our regulatory systems. Under the TTC, we have deepened our information sharing abilities and built transatlantic relationships in smaller groups that specialize on standards or other specific areas of cooperation. Another area that there's really good cooperation between the US and Europe, as well as almost 60 other partners around the world, is the launch earlier this year of the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which is something that we worked very closely together on to really reinvigorate a vision of an open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet that respects human rights and enables economic growth and competition. And the European Commission, along with the Czech EU presidency, will co host a high level multi stakeholder event on the future of the internet November 2nd in Prague. And we see this as a really good opportunity to continue engagement with like minded partners around the world on these important issues. In other areas where the US and Europe are able to work together in engaging with other partners, we cooperate a lot in multilateral fora, whether it's the UN, NATO, the OECD, or most recently, I'll talk about the International Telecommunications Union, where a US candidate was elected by overwhelming support to become the next Secretary General of the ITU, that's Doreen Bogdan Martin, and as well an EU candidate from Lithuania was elected to be the next Deputy Secretary General. And so this is not just a diplomatic success for our transatlantic community, but also a clear signal that the vast majority of the world shares our vision and our values for the future of the internet and technology. Despite the US robust framework on EU US cooperation, of course, there are still areas where we may not always have a shared approach. And so I think when we think about cooperation on digital issues and the questions around digital sovereignty, competition policy, or digital regulatory frameworks, or our approach to data security, um, I think it's important to remember. And I think one thing that the TTC has helped us to remember is that we often share the same objectives and the same values. We just have different approaches to thinking through how we may go about accomplish them based on our different political systems. But the US and Europe don't have to have completely identical regulatory systems. And I think what's key is that in the areas where we do share objectives, we focus on interoperable solutions that can accommodate different models of governments and different political systems. Um, as mentioned, recently President Biden signed an executive order to implement US commitments under the EU US data privacy framework. And we hope that this forms the basis of an adequacy decision that restores legal certainty to US EU data flows. But I think as we think about how do we partner together and think about sort of global values in this space, we see the Global Forum on Cross-Border Data Privacy Rules as an area where the US and Europe may further collaborate, looking at cross-border data flows, not just transatlantically, but around the world. They are the lifeblood of the modern global economy and are critical for private companies and public services across all sectors, whether it's education, health, scientific research, or law enforcement. And the CBPRs put in place flexible, effective, and enforceable privacy rules that facilitate data flows. And so these are, one area where we could look at deepening cooperation with the US and Europe, particularly as we think about third countries. Another area is thinking about financing for secure and trustworthy telecommunications networks and projects around the world in developing countries as another area where the US and Europe share values and approaches and can look for ways to better cooperate. So I will close by saying that there are a lot of very valuable conversations happening between the US and Europe, and also a lot of opportunity for us to work together on some shared global challenges. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ruth. So let me, since you're both working in newly established offices, let me ask you both first to kind of comment on, the goals of, in your case, Ruth, the new Bureau for Cyberspace and Digital Policy. Could you tell us a little bit about what the office's priorities are, and in particular specific goals to foster transatlantic tech collaboration? Now, you touched on some of that already in your opening remarks, but I'd love to, in particular, learn more about some of the ideas that you guys are working on in terms of facilitating the financing of digital infrastructure development around the world.
Sure. So thank you for asking. In April, Secretary Blinken established the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the Department of State, and it brought together two existing parts of the department under one roof and also created a new policy area. So we have three policy units. The first is my office, which is the Office of International Information and Communications Policy. We also have the Division of International Cyberspace Security and a new unit on digital freedom. And what this does is it enables the department to look at the challenges and opportunities posed by technology in the digital ecosystem from a national security, human rights, and economic perspective, and to really integrate these viewpoints and elevate them within our foreign policy. And I think if you look at the work of the TTC, there are a number of different work streams that touch on all three aspects of this, whether it's the misuse of tech, whether it's the secure and trustworthy ICT, whether it's digital platform regulation. You can see that there's these issues are across the spectrum play a strong role in US EU cooperation and conversation. And I would also say they are all issues and areas that are articulated in the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which also touches on the economic aspects, the national security, cybersecurity aspects, as well as human rights of the internet and digital ecosystem. So I think there's a number of opportunities for us to continue to engage with the European Commission and with partners around the world across the full range of these issues.
So, Gerard, you're the inaugural head of the EU's new office in San Francisco. As you think about your upcoming tenure, what do you seek to accomplish in your time there?
Well, I think we're here to first to connect, to learn. A lot of the new technologies of the future are being developed here, and I think it's important we keep our finger to the pulse. And also from a digital diplomacy point of view, I think Ruth quite well, I mean, excellently, eloquently sketched the kind of the importance of our values, the importance of our like democratic systems, our fundamental rights, and they are actually reflected in the vision for the future of the internet. This is something where the technology and our values need to come together. I mean, actually, this has to be kind of integrated in the next kind of technological developments and say the European perspective here. And again, I think very largely shared with the US, even though our regulatory policy approaches might differ. I think here that this kind of making sure that technology contributes to our societal well-being, that it's technology for people to address, say, our major societal challenges that we face is something that we think is tremendously important, particularly because of these alternative visions of how technology can be used to repress people, to undermine human rights. So if we can bring some of that perspective of the European Union into the debate here at the time when the technology is still being conceived and developed, we think that could be quite positive, both for the EU, but also for the US and for the industry and for the world at large. So that's what we are trying to achieve in the next coming kind of months and years that we will be here.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it's an excellent initiative, and I think one that's warmly welcomed here in the United States. So, very eager to see how it all transpires. I have a question for both of you. I'd love to get your perspective on where you see the greatest areas of opportunity for transatlantic tech cooperation in the next few years. And Ruth, maybe you want to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I think looking at digital connectivity in third countries, I know with the European Commission, they have the Global Gateway program, and we also in the United States have the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. We also, under the recently passed Chips and Science Act, there's funding at $100 million a year for over 5 years for the Department of State for an international technology innovation and security fund, or security and innovation fund, to look at both semiconductor supply chains, as well as the deployment and adoption of secure telecommunications networks. And so I think working together with the European Commission on how do we bring the tools that we have to bear, whether it's through development banks or export credit authorities or really development assistance, to help countries realize the full potential that that digital connectivity can bring to their citizens, to their society, to their economies, without having to sacrifice the security of their networks. And I think that that's a really important area. And I think part of it is also focus on how do we create a more robust and resilient supply chain. So there is a limited number of players in this space, and so thinking about how we can work together with European companies, with the European Commission, U.S. companies, and really work potentially through looking at open radio access networks as ways to create a lot more diversity and drive down costs in the supply chain as a way to help meet the incredible demand for digital connectivity around the world. I'm not a semiconductor expert, but I also think there's a lot of work in that space to happen between the US and Europe, mapping out supply chains, avoiding subsidy races to the bottom, and really looking at how do we friendshore and nearshore these critical technology inputs that we need for both of our economies, to help ensure that we have for both our national and economic security the inputs that we need. Um, I think also continuing to look at tech accountability, tech platform regulation. How do we look at algorithms, algorithmic amplification, data to access for researchers, and how do we think about countering some issues around misinformation and disinformation are all areas where the European Commission is certainly very forward leaning, and areas that we, in many respects, share some of the same objectives. And so talking through how we can work together to address some of these harms, and engage with many online platforms in this space, and of course AI. I think there's a lot of opportunity there as we think about the norms and standards for how AI is developed and deployed over the coming years.
Well, it's excellent to hear such a wide-ranging list of opportunities. Gerard, what's your take? Where do you see the greatest areas of opportunity lying?
Well, I fully agree with what Ruth has just sketched in terms of areas where we need to cooperate. I think just to maybe illustrate it a bit more, if we look at Africa, which is of course a very important strategic region for the European Union, with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of these countries are now leaning more, or at least have become dependent on China in many ways, and that is not acceptable from a strategic point of view, and is also not in the interest of these countries. So working together with the US, and in the context of the TTC in December, we would expect already to identify a number of countries, both like Central American country and possibly an African country, where we will combine forces to support these countries successfully making the digital transformation, both in terms of improving their connectivity, but also improving their capacity, for example, to provide government services, the capacity also to fight disinformation and cyber attacks. So that's, I think, a very concrete example. Other areas, again, fully agree with what Ruth has just said. Standards, critical. Global standards. It's always politically challenging to get the attention of our political leadership. Let's discuss standards, and they run for a mile. But I think they have increasingly understood that standards, if you set the standards, you basically own the market. You set and standards, both technical standards, but of course also regulatory standards. So this is an area where also in the TTC there's a lot of attention. We are identifying specific areas where we will work closely together, make joint proposals in the international standards organizations in order to pursue our common interest. Maybe I should highlight quantum. And I'm highlighting these points because in the time horizons of 4 to 5 years, these are going to be overwhelmingly important technologies. That they are already very powerful, but if you manage to, if we as EU and US, we're not on top of quantum, if we're not leading quantum, just think about the cybersecurity. No encryption would be safe anymore in our countries. We would be exposed to major risks in terms of our national security. So that's a technology where we also have to work very, very closely together, and it's center stage in the context of the TTC. Disinformation, clearly very important, also because a lot, of course, of the big tech platforms are in the US, and we work with them very, very successfully, for example, to keep disinformation out of Ukraine, to try to deflect the disinformation from Russia in Africa and in Central America and Latin America, blaming the EU and the US for the global famine, the food shortages there. I think we're successfully kind of also building the necessary counter narrative. So there's a lot of that work that's going on, both short term, but also particularly in the medium and to the longer term. And I think it's very promising, and it's very important.
So there's plenty of opportunity for close collaboration between the European Union and the United States, but there are, of course, some divergences in the transatlantic relationship. So what are some of the irritants that we need to successfully address so that it doesn't hinder effective collaboration in the next few years? Who would like to take that one first?
Well, I don't think there are that many, frankly. I mean, I don't think we should not kind of pretend that somehow there's a long list of irritants or potential irritants. I mean, obviously we have the privacy shield. I mean, the discussions around an adequacy finding. There were a number of decisions by the European Court of Justice that kind of have led us to start the negotiations, which have come to an end, and the ball is back in our court. And I think we are quite confident that within, say, the next months, we estimate about 6 months, that at least there's a very good chance for a positive adequacy finding. So that would then put that issue to bed. I mean, in terms of other major issues, there's always a bit this concern. I mean, terms, whenever you throw around terms like digital sovereignty or strategic autonomy, I mean, you get kind of some people feeling this smacks of protectionism. And of course, we have to be careful that that's not the case. I mean, I know there's some concerns about kind of cloud certification amongst the US administration, the US industry. I think that we can manage. I mean, we are going to, the Digital Markets Act was signed into law and published and will enter into force on the 1st of November. So in less than 2 weeks time. I mean, the Digital Service Act will follow suit. I mean, we've got to manage that. And I think we've had very constructive discussions with the US administration and also with the US industry. There is a very intensive discussion going on with those, say, major tech platforms, which are likely going to be in scope, and the focus is very much on compliance and on implementation. So I am quite optimistic. I mean, there will be the occasional hiccup and legal challenge, etc. That's absolutely normal. But I don't have any kind of indications to believe that this will spill over into the political relationship between the EU and the US, and precisely because the objectives are largely shared. I mean, we want the internet to be safe. I think everybody would agree that these platforms have a responsibility and an accountability to keep the internet safe from terrorist content and illegal hate speech and child sex abuse material and disinformation. And I think that's what we're trying to do in a measured way with the European legislation. I think we also agree that the internet market space should be contestable, should be open, that competition should thrive, and that those who have are innovating should have a good shot at getting a fair share of that market. And then again, in the implementation, there might be certain issues that arise, but I would definitely not leave the audience here with the feeling that we have a kind of a huge number of trade irritants that we have to manage. I think we have very few, and actually the one that has been maybe the most prominent is about to be put to bed.
Okay, that's excellent. Ruth, what's your take on the question of irritants?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the US and Europe, as we've sort of both of us reiterated, often share the same objectives or the same sort of desire to see a safe internet, to have flourishing economies based on, innovation and competition. But we have different approaches sometimes as to how we go about that. And of course, the United States wants to ensure that, there is US companies aren't being targeted. And of course, as Gerard mentioned, there are, certain legislative proposals going through Europe, such as the AI Act or the European Cloud Services Security Certification, or the Data Act, where we have questions about how that may be implemented. But I think the main point about this is that, and I think the most interesting story on this is that because of the TTC and because of the incredible relationships that have been built at the technical and political level, we have a forum to talk about these issues. And it's not always on the front page because as close allies, we have conversations every day about issues of mutual concern that may not sort of rise to the level of a big deliverable for a political meeting. But I think we have the relationships and the processes in place to be able to address these things and to begin to start to focus on how do we think about some of these things in a global context. How do we focus based on our shared values in looking at how we approach and engage with third countries? So it's not just about looking in and admiring our differences, but really celebrating our commonalities along with our other partners and looking at how we can promote a global ecosystem that reflects democratic values and human rights.
Okay, excellent. So we have a few audience questions coming in that are digging a little deeper on some of the items that you both just mentioned. And so, Gerard, let me turn to you first on this question from James regarding the French National Cybersecurity Agency noted the importance of American cloud providers, but also said that they harm French sovereignty. So how does those kinds of expressions of digital sovereignty impact transatlantic cooperation, particularly when American companies are portrayed as being threats? Could you expand a bit on that aspect of the concept of digital sovereignty?
I mean, the first point I should like to make is that American companies have been tremendously successful in Europe and in the internal market, and that's great. They're bringing a lot of benefits, they're bringing a lot of innovations, they are dynamic in many respects. So I think from both sides we have benefited. The European Union has benefited from the presence and the investments and say the offerings of US tech companies, and vice versa. Of course, the US and these tech companies have benefited from having very wide and large and unfettered access to the single market. So that is the context. And then, of course, there may be, US companies hold about 98% of the cloud market in the European Union. So make no mistake, this is like a US dominated market. There is no prospect, practically speaking, for the EU. We have a very small, some small cloud providers. Of course, we have ambitions to grow and to, but there's no prospect that that presence of the US will diminish anytime soon. I mean, we could not do in the European Union without the cloud provision of the US companies. That doesn't mean that there aren't sometimes the concerns. I mean, there's the US Cloud Act, that mandates, or at least gives the US government the powers to access data through the cloud providers, which are, as I said, to largely the US companies to access European data. That is a major concern in the European Union, and we need to find a way to address those concerns. And the way is not to close off our markets, because we would shoot ourselves tremendously in the foot, because then we cannot operate without the US cloud providers, to be clear. The access is what we're talking about in terms of the cloud certification is a very small part of the market, which is around national security, which anyway, any country has, also under the WTO, we have the national security exemption. So we talk about a very small segment of the cloud market where major national interests are at stake. So the comment, I think, although I can't speak for the French authority, is probably made from that national security perspective, but that is a very, very small segment of the overall cloud market, which is largely dominated, and I use the word dominated not with a negative connotation, actually with a positive connotation, by US providers.
No, I appreciate that, Gerard. Ruth, do you have any thoughts you want to add to that?
Sure. I think briefly, how countries think about their national security and sensitive national security data, of course, is very important and a very, for lack of a better word, personal decision that governments need to take about how they ensure their national security. I think, our concerns with the proposed EU cybersecurity certification scheme for cloud is really the domestic ownership requirements, and sort of the sense that if U.S. cloud companies want to do business, they would then need to transfer that technology to European companies, which of course is something that is pretty something that U.S. companies would see as a pretty fundamental threat to their business models. And so I think that you know, this is something that we've had a lot of conversations about with the European Commission and with the French to discuss various models here. And I think, there are efforts underway, including if you look at the OECD when it looks at trusted government access to data, that very clearly demonstrate that the rules and safeguards and checks and balances on how governments access data held by the private sector are actually shared between the U.S. and many European countries, including countries like France and Germany. And so there's a lot more commonality there. And so I think we really would like to see a risk-based approach that looks into does not treat companies that are headquartered in countries of friends and allies the same as companies that may be headquartered within authoritarian regimes. And so I think those are continued areas of conversation, but I think there's a lot of efforts underway, including the data privacy framework, as well as work at the OECD, that really demonstrate that there's a lot of commonalities when it comes to the checks and balances to ensure the safety of this data. And I would also just note briefly, in the Ukraine context, they had a data localization requirement for their government data, and that became extremely problematic when Russia further invaded Ukraine, and there were targets or attacks against those data centers. And so I think it's important to really think about what does actually raise the bar of security, and often localization and requiring the use of non-US companies does not always result in greater security or reliability for those data centers.
All right, so Doug has a question for both of you. This is regarding regulations. So Doug is interested to know whether you see the US and the EU competing on regulatory regimes, and if so, do you think that will distinguish whether one is proving more successful than the other, particularly when it comes to the technology sector?
I mean, we're regulating in the EU because we think that this regulation will help the EU and serve its social and economic interests. And of course, we always have the single market close at heart, because if we leave a vacuum at the central level, then the member states will fill that vacuum, and then we will have fragmentation of our single market, which is the greatest handicap that the European Union has been suffering from in terms of supporting our technology companies and startups to scale up in the European Union. It's just very complicated. If every time you want to expand, you have to adjust your business model to rules which are different from the rules of the member states where you have been operating before. I think we've said it, I mean, the regulatory approach is different between the EU and the US, and that is not in itself a problem. We need to manage that kind of interface, and I think what is important is that, say, the problem analysis, the objectives are not fundamentally different. It is the way we implement these policy objectives. I mean, we believe that the rules that and there's often a caricature, which I've been in California now for like 2 months, and I've come across that caricature a few times, that regulation equals stifling of innovation, and particularly in technology, which is very fast moving. I mean, now we do not tend to regulate the technology, we tend to regulate, say, the consequences, the impacts of technology, but we actually believe that regulation will provide trust in the market. If you take AI, for example, I mean, if people in the EU or presumably also in the US, if they don't trust that AI will actually protect their fundamental interest when they apply for a mortgage, when they get kind of a medical diagnosis, they will shun AI. And we also don't want to have untrustworthy AI, for example, coming from China into our market. So if we set a standard, our regulatory standard for AI, that type of kind of applications won't be usable, because they will be prohibited in the European Union. So that is an example. The DMA is another example where we want competition, and maybe as just not necessarily linked to this, but I mean, we have a lot of regulation in the EU, but my experience now, being like 2 months in the US, is we have in many sectors more competition than in the EU. If you take the banking sector, the fintech sector, or the energy sector, there's a lot more competition in the EU thanks to regulation. Telecoms as well. I mean, I have a subscription here in the US. I pay 3 times as much for kind of getting the same as I get in the EU. And that is thanks to regulation. Regulation has priced open markets in the European Union, has attacked monopolistic or oligopolistic behaviors, and that is a good thing. That benefits kind of our innovation, because that gives a chance to those who have better solutions, better mousetraps to come into the market, and it benefits the consumers and the citizens because they will have wider choice and more affordable prices. So that kind of regulation is bad. No, bad regulation is bad. Good regulation is good.
Ruth, what's your perspective on this point?
Yeah, I think that, where regulation helps to increase competition, it can help support innovation. And so I agree with Gerard that, it's not that, all regulation is bad and that we don't have any regulation in the United States, which we certainly do. And I think looking at the White House's recent announcement of a tech accountability agenda that looks at several areas, calling on Congress to take action, is a demonstration of that. I think it really is about a risk-based approach. And, I don't think that the US and Europe are going to ever have, identical approaches. And I think what we can do is seek to minimize the sort of divergence between some of these approaches and how they're implemented, because I think it's in every company's interest around the world for both of our economies to ensure that companies have access to as broad of a global market as possible for their goods and services that help to make people's lives better. And I think, to be frank, I think some of this time will tell. We will see sort of what the impact are. There are a lot of moves being made right now in the European Commission in this space, and I think it's probably too early to predict. And it depends on what are the specific standards that will be put in place when it comes to the implementation and enforcement of these pieces of legislation. And so I think a little bit, the jury is out. And I think if there are lessons learned about the European approach, that's something that, certainly we would hope the United States would also take on board as we look towards solving some of these issues domestically. Which I will also caveat is not the role of the Department of State, who is very focused on foreign policy.
Of course, of course. So one quick final question for you both before I transition over to our panel. So the EU-US Trade and Technology Council will meet again in December. A very ambitious agenda was laid out in May. What should we look for in the December meeting? Just a quick soundbite.
Well, when we had the meeting in May in Saclay in Paris, which was also it's a successful meeting. This was, of course, very much dominated also by Ukraine and Russia, you can understand. The key message, and I think we've all felt it, I'm sure Ruth and I have felt it, we need to be ambitious. We need to come with very concrete deliverables. And I could not agree more with Ruth that kind of course, and you have a political meeting. I mean, no political meeting is a success when you can say that we agreed on X, Y, and Z. But the fact that we have this channel of cooperation, that we kind of just pick up the phone, we talk, the scope for misunderstandings is virtually zero, because we talk all the time. I think that is maybe one of the greatest, at least intangible benefits maybe of the TTC. We've never been better informed about each other's policy intentions, about each other policies. And if there is something we are concerned about, like the EU Cloud Act or some other things on the US side, we talk. And we are not going to shout, and we're not going to threaten and everything else. I think that's very positive. But for December, I think we're building on what we have already achieved. I think on standards, we can go further. We have that kind of early warning system where we're now kind of going to develop some kind of concrete, say in specific areas, standards that we want to push internationally. The point that Ruth also made, how can we work with some of the developing countries to get them kind of to a higher level, and also to show that, say, the model that we are promoting globally is the best model for them, rather than, because of course China and to some extent Russia are also trying to kind of influence the positions of these countries in the developing world, and we have to kind of make sure that they come to our models rather than to the authoritarian models. I mean, we have good work progressing on AI. We are working together on the roadmap and the risk. I mean, also the risk-based approach, which is very much at the heart of what the EU does. I mean, to work with the US to have a common approaches towards measuring and monitoring the risks of AI is a very good kind of interface, even if kind of we regulate and maybe the US does not. I mean, at least we have a common understanding about what matters most in terms of the deployment of AI in our societies and our economies. I mean, we work together on cybersecurity, on many things. So, I mean, I think there will be a good harvest in early December, and I think kind of observers will be able to see that the Trade and Technology Council is a very productive forum, and that also should kind of continue. I mean, in a way, we should try to make it independent from the political cycle, because it's a forum that, like, post 2024, when, I mean, you have to say the elections here, we also have elections in the European Union. This forum should continue to exist because we need it, both of us. The kind of the need for a forum like this is not going to go away after even political change in years to come.
Great. Ruth, quick thought you want to add to that?
Thanks. That was very well put. I guess the only thing that I would add is, yeah, I think the last few meetings have served well to sort of set the stage and look at the parameters of priorities for cooperation against a broad set of really critical issues. And so I think as we think through the next ministerial, it's like, okay, how do we really translate those into action? And what are a few key areas where we can really demonstrate the fruits of the labor of this renewed transatlantic cooperation? And so very much looking forward to the next ministerial and continuing to work closely with the European Commission, including Gerard and DG, his former colleagues at DG Connect, who are really close partners on this.
All right, fantastic. Well, with that, Ruth Berry, thank you so much for being with us today. It was an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to talk about transatlantic tech strategy and cooperation. So with that, let me now turn things over to my colleagues, Carissa Nietzsche and Hannah Kelly, for our panel discussion.
Thanks, Martin. We're delighted to now turn to our industry and expert panel to delve deeper into opportunities for transatlantic technology cooperation. I'm Carissa Nietzsche, an associate fellow in CNAS's Transatlantic Security Program.
And I'm Hannah Kelly, a research assistant in CNAS's Technology and National Security Program. And today we are joined by two fantastic panelists. First up, we have Meg Harden, Vice President, Government Relations for Infineon Technologies Americas Corps. For 20 years, Meg has partnered with Infineon senior leadership to advocate for technology and innovation policies that support a competitive U.S. semiconductor industry and a healthy innovation ecosystem served by those semiconductors. Prior to joining Infineon, Meg has had international trade and investment consultants experience working with small and large companies seeking to identify new markets and partners. We are likewise joined today by Francis G. Burwell, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council and a Senior Director at McLarty Associates. Until January 2017, Francis served as Vice President, European Union and Special Initiatives at the Council. She has served as Director of the Council's Program on Transatlantic Relations and as Interim Director of the Global Business and Economics Program. Currently, Francis directs the Transatlantic Digital Marketplace Initiative. Thank you both for joining us today.
So we'll kick this segment off with a moderated conversation, but audience members, we'd love to hear from you. So please send in your questions using the chat function at cnas.com/live or by tweeting them with the hashtag CNAS2022. So we'll work to weave your questions into the discussion. But to start out, let's start at the 5,000-foot level. So a question for both of you. If you could grade the transatlantic technology relationship at this moment in time, what grade would you give it and why? So Fran, let's start with you.
I've tried to resist great inflation here. And I think that I would give it a B. And what I would say is that we're seeing steady improvement, but we have occasionally very big errors. And I think that the TTC is part of this. We have seen since the founding of the TTC, as your previous panelist noted, it's become a very good way of communicating about issues. And so we've seen some convergence. The US just released a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. We've seen the administration put out some things about cybersecurity that are not dissimilar to the new proposal the EU has done for the Cyber Resilience Act. So there are some areas of convergence, and of course, I should mention the data transfers agreement that the EO that came out a while ago. But then every now and then, there's something, and they mentioned your previous panelist mentioned the cloud services cyber certification. But I would say the Inflation Reduction Act with the EV content requirements has really thrown a wrench into the discussions. And, both parties have guilt in these things. We both do things that are done for domestic reasons that have impacts. And that's what keeps this relationship from getting an A- right now.
I'm also going to give it a B, but I gave it a B plus, Fran. I wasn't hugely specific on that, but B is sort of average, and I think we're in a good place. I think that there's a lot of discussion. I actually think the US-EU TTC has been a great vehicle to kind of bring a framework around a lot of discussions that were happening from the industry side. So, when I look at the level of activity of US technology companies in Europe and the level of activity of European companies here in the United States, it's hugely significant. And so the barriers are not terrible. The barriers are annoying, and most of them can be sorted out. And there's a really strong will to do so, and a really high level of engagement and cooperation among US and European companies with their government entities to try to make a difference. So yeah, I give it a B plus.
Digging into that a little bit more, I would love to hear from Fran what you expect to see or maybe hope to see in the December TTC meeting. What could maybe bump that grade up to the top mark? And then Meg, zooming a little more into the semiconductor piece, I would just love to hear about some of the key initiatives in the TTC's semiconductor working group, maybe where you see the most constructive conversation happening.
Sure.
So let me say that I'd start with specifics. There are two ways of looking at success on the TTC. One is specific projects and deliverables, and the other one is just the general atmospherics. On the deliverables, I know a lot of people criticize the TTC for not having delivered much yet, but I think that actually it's doing important work in setting a foundation for further cooperation in the area of emerging technologies. So the idea of having something that would be a way of measuring and of assessing AI. And I think that that's important. Things like, are we measuring greenhouse gases the same way? And setting standards for that in the same way? Because next year, the EU is going to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And we have to be able to measure things that are made in the United States using the same criteria, or otherwise they're going to run into problems with CBAM. So there are a lot of things like this. The move to cooperate more and invest more in the international standard setting bodies, these are all very important. I won't say they're exciting. And I think especially for, Secretary of State, maybe the Secretary of Commerce, maybe Secretary Raimondo finds them more interesting, but I think that these are not the things that ministers like to do, but it's important. For the ministers, I think, like to work more, or we expect them to set the tone, is in the more general element of success, which is as a platform for discussions. And your previous guest made very clear how important it has been that they now feel like they can just talk about stuff. And they can do it in a relatively low volume. You don't have to yell, you don't have to demonstrate about stuff and threaten each other, because you're always going to see the next person. And it's not just that they only see each other, even at the ministerial level, at these biannual meetings. They're seeing each other, every time Vestager comes over here, she sees Raimondo and Ty, and the same thing. I know Executive Vice President Dombrovskis was here last week, and he also saw Secretary Raimondo, USTR Ty. So I think, this type of stuff is going on much more frequently than it used to. So I think we can expect to build on that. I think one area, though, that is proving very problematic for the TTC, and that is the connection with current legislative files, where we are both doing things, although the EU is doing more hard rules than we are, as opposed to what we do, which is issue guidelines a lot of the times. It's very hard to avoid talking about that, but the TTC officially doesn't work on current legislative files. And as a result, I think some of the most obvious stakeholders in the TTC, i.e. the business community, don't always feel like their interests are being represented. I certainly have been in many meetings where business stakeholders have been concerned not only about issues, but about their ability to interact with the TTC and to input their views into the TTC. So I push that as a big question mark for December.
Well, I think you teed up Meg's comments perhaps pretty well. I'd love to hear from the business perspective, from the industry perspective, how that tone setting from the top is facilitating some of those conversations, specifically in the semiconductor working group.
Well, there's no question it is. The TTC has been a great vehicle for us as a company to put a lot of transatlantic issues forward. Infineon has a very big presence here in the United States, and we love it as a bridge to address some very specific interests of ours, like R&D collaboration, which just needs to be happening. More of that needs to be happening. We've also found the supply chain topic, the supply chain resilience and transparency topic, to be very well given a lot of momentum by the TTC. I don't think it would have any otherwise. And so that's been a big positive. And then the up and coming topic it's going to be really important is workforce development. Again, hard to find a framework to talk about those things without something like the US EU TTC. So we think that's going to be a critical one. But it is definitely, I think, right that the mechanism to engage industry could be strengthened. On the EU side, of course, there's a lot more structure. They have the Futurium and the working groups where the companies were all invited in to join these working groups, and there's regular interaction and participants. It has been conducted in the United States primarily through RFIs that come out and ask opinions, but that leaves you a little less connected as companies to the process. So I do think there's room for more stakeholder input from the industry side, because these are really important policies that are being developed, and the Transatlantic Alliance is going to be so critical to launching a more global view of some of these topics. And so making sure that the governments are close to the industry stakeholders is really important.
Thank you, Megan and Fran, both on the TTC point and kind of what's going well, what we expect for December. Fran, I'd love to turn to you. You mentioned in your grading of the U.S. and Europe technology relationship a really important new development with the executive order from President Biden signed to implement the European Union-U.S. data privacy framework. For those of us not following it as closely as you, what are the next steps there? Kind of what are we looking for now from the commission on that? And then the $1 million question, do you assess that this framework will withstand the scrutiny of privacy activists in Europe, of the European Court of Justice? Kind of, what do we have in the next months as we look ahead on that?
So I think we have a ways to go. This executive order was a crucial step forward, and we wouldn't be anywhere without it. And I should point out, this executive order is really a result of negotiation, not the executive order itself, but it comes out of these negotiations that have gone on for 2 years now. Remember that the appointment of the new negotiator on data, data transfers was done the first day of the Biden administration, which speaks to how seriously they took this issue. And so I think what we're going to see now, this executive order, the commission is so familiar with this executive order that they should not have any problems with it. But what they have to do is they write an opinion saying that, we hope, that the US now is adequate in the way that it handles data that is transferred and the types of protections that it offers for EU citizens and EU residents whose data might be transferred to the United States. That opinion will go to various bodies in Europe, such as the European Data Protection Board, some of the national data supervisors, I believe, not quite sure on that stage, and they come back and comment on the Commission's proposal. This doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take a few months. And at that point, when the Commission issues its final opinion, then we will be in a situation where everything will be confirmed, et cetera. We do certainly expect that that opinion will be challenged by various individuals or institutions once it is in force. So Max Schrems, who started both the first and second case, has already indicated on Twitter some of his concerns about the executive order. So we do, I think all parties to this expect a legal challenge. But I think that this time, the US has moved very, very far, and I think has provided all reasonable reassurances and tried to speak particularly to the issues of redress and necessity and proportionality that were outlined in the ECJ opinion. And so fingers crossed, this time, third time's the charm, right? And hopefully we will have a data transfers regime that works.
Excellent. This next question is for Meg, pulling a little more at a thread that we were speaking on earlier. So industry is the engine of innovation. We see this across critical technology sectors. And I think in recent years, we've seen this particularly emphasized in the semiconductor context. But when we talk about the transatlantic tech relationship, it's often within the context of government cooperation. So we already sort of touched on the need to better engage industry. But I'd love to hear maybe how industry is playing a role in driving the conversation in the TTC, where you've seen opportunities to sort of inject or infuse considerations. And then to that piece of needing better engagement from industry, how that might come about, how you think it might work better, that relationship between industry and government.
Okay, sure. So I can't speak comprehensively because we're just one company, but the area that we have engaged in the most, and I think have been driving the conversation rather than reacting to it, is on supply chain resilience. And this is, of course, because there's shortages that, turned the global economy upside down, and many of the end markets were quite vocal with the government in sharing their perspective on what those chip shortages meant. And it required us, by the way, as the largest supplier of chips to the auto industry worldwide, to help the government understand the supply chain, the semiconductor supply chain, from the perspective of a chip manufacturer. And one of the most important things for them to understand was the complexity, and that chips are not interchangeable. First of all, they're all different. There are many different flavors. Takes anywhere from 6 to 18 months to make a single chip, and it goes around the world multiple times to multiple locations to be made. And so there are no simple solutions. There are no silver bullet solutions to trying to better understand and have greater transparency. But it's a topic that really interests our company and many others. The semiconductor industry overall has a very clean, well-run supply chain. So we made a major effort to help educate governments, both in the United States and in Europe, about the supply chain at a fairly high level of detail, and about potential solutions. And we're engaged in groups in both countries or in both regions with potential technology solutions on supply chain. So I think it's a really good example of how the government knew there was a problem to solve, but really is not in the position to solve that problem without input and really detailed input over time from the private sector, from industry. And I think there is that recognition there. It might not have been there at the start, but it certainly is there now. And it's not something that can be solved by the government. So they're really dependent. I think that's one really good example. And we feel in a pretty good place. And from our perspective, the more the government understands about this, the better policy they're going to be able to make. So it's important for companies to engage and constructively.
Meg, we completely agree with engaging industry on that point. Supply chain resiliency also brings up another set of stakeholders and partners that we might need to engage, and that's democratic partners outside of the transatlantic dialogue. So I'd be very curious to hear, how you're both thinking about how we can better engage partners around the globe, but also specifically in the Indo-Pacific. And then zooming in a little bit on the semiconductor piece, how far can the transatlantic partners get on these issues without including other semiconductor producing nations in discussions? How can we link perhaps the TTC conversation with the very nascent Chip 4 dialogues between the US, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan? How are you thinking about these issues? Fran, we'll start with you.
So I think you've raised a really crucial issue, and one that the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has brought front and center. I would point out that a lot of those involved in export controls on vis-a-vis Russia are, of course, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. There are many other countries involved in this coalition that is using both export controls and sanctions to address Russian aggression. So I do think, however, that the TTC is and should remain a bilateral organization. And it is an excellent place for the US and the EU as the two biggest markets in the, shall we say the democratic world, as the two biggest markets to figure out what works for them, figure out what the questions are. And Meg has made the excellent point that a lot of times at the beginning of these discussions, the government officials in charge don't always understand exactly how a particular supply chain or industry works or whatever. It's not that they don't want to, it's just that they need more information. So I think there's an important kind of fact-finding phase that we all go through. That said, I think that the TTC is a place where one can develop between the United States and Europe some ideas and then begin to take them elsewhere. We still do have the one thing that has survived from the Trump administration, the US, EU, Japan dialogue. And that, I hear, is still going well in terms of WTO and non-market economies. So I think those are the types of things we can look at. I think we need to look at some of the declarations, some of the guidelines that we have looked at over the last few years through the G7, G20 less now, but earlier, So for example, data free flow with trust. How do you actually make that something that has legs and has criteria? How can you take a multilateral or plurilateral declaration like that and reconcile it with domestic legislation so that you actually are creating a situation where other countries can let their data go to you and trust that it will be well prepared, but also that you're not blocking others who can do that because they perhaps don't meet the incredible standards that you have set domestically. Similarly, I think, Carissa, you mentioned, someone mentioned earlier today in this session, the Declaration on the Future of the Internet. It's a lot of very high-minded sounding objectives. How do you, in regulation or guidelines, what are the specifics to make those something that works well? And where you can say that a country is actually adhering to that declaration. If they sign up, they should adhere to it. What are the benchmarks that we would look at? And can we together, not just the US and the EU, but there were 60 countries that signed that. How can we think about those countries and how they would implement the declaration or provide assurances that they are in fact living up to different areas of the declaration? So I think there's a lot that can be done. I think that businesses have supply chains that go around the world. And we should be thinking about, in some of those crucial supply chains, which countries are most important and can we bring them into this, shall we call it a democratic digital club or something like that, as a way of securing that, both the supply chains, but also, as some other folks have said, I mean, the TTC is a lot about values. It's a lot about democracy. And so we should expand that to the other democratic countries around the world.
Yeah, so I'm going to agree, Fran, that we have to focus on the US-EU TTC. It's a great vehicle, and it's a diplomatic vehicle about principles and shared values. And then citing the earlier panelists, we need to get concrete for it to be real, for it to be meaningful. It needs to be concrete. And that's where industry needs to come in. And it's important in our industry, in the semiconductor industry, to recognize that the semiconductor industry was literally built on a global free trade platform. And so, and it's the other important thing is that it's a heavily capital intensive industry. So we have very significant investments all over the world and a highly efficient supply chain. Now, things are shifting and changing, but you cannot, in the short term, pick up and replace and move around huge capital investments and just completely alter the supply chain, nor would it be advisable or affordable, let's say, to replicate complete semiconductor manufacturing ecosystems in every region of the world. So to your question, Carissa, yes, it has to be global. In other words, we have to be having global discussions about all of these topics. It's not good enough just to talk about transatlantic, except at the diplomatic level. That is good. But if we are going to be concrete, we have to find platforms where industry is deeply engaged and not replicating other efforts. So there is something called the World Semiconductor Council, which is an industry group, and there are regional chapters of this all around the world. They come together multiple times a year. One of those times, the regional governments are included. In other words, there is a platform for our industry. So how do we not abandon frameworks that are currently set up and adding some value, while also absorbing and integrating these diplomatic shifts, these geopolitical shifts. It's not, there are no easy answers to that, but there has to be a recognition that we are an industry seeking to operate in an environment that allows chips to continue to be provided. We don't want any more shortages and interruptions and disturbances if possible. But we also do not want to make making chips so expensive due to all of these other intervening factors that they can no longer propel the level of innovation that they have across the economies. I mean, one of the reasons we all have, whether it's huge smart TVs or the latest iPhone or really energy efficient equipment running our furnaces in our houses, is because the cost of chips came down and down and down and enabled so much other innovation. And so I'm only saying we need to be careful, and we need to be really aware of the implications of shifting a lot of this supply chain without really close engagement by the industry.
Can I just add one thing? I think it is important that our industries be resilient, and both the US and the EU are attempting to do that to some degree by onshoring, right, by reshoring chips and everything back home. But we have to be careful as we do that. First off, what are we defining as critical sectors? Is it PPE? I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that one could define as critical that maybe isn't really critical. But it depends where you sit, and what your priorities are. I think that it is important that we talk together and with our friends about what resilience entails and whether we need to, and I would disagree with this. I think that there are some politicians who would say the only way that the US can have resilient supply chains is to make everything American. But there's no reason that supply chains that go to Europe, that go elsewhere to our friends, and hopefully an expanding level of friends, right, can't be considered resilient. And one thing that concerns me is that in our efforts to make things resilient, we throw up barriers that treat our friends the same way they treat our allies. If you look at in the EU, their legislation usually distinguishes, if it makes a distinction along these lines, it distinguishes between EU and non-EU. We do the same thing with Buy America. And those create barriers between ourselves. I know politically, it's very hard to get rid of that or to overcome that, but I think it's something that we should be discussing.
Agreed.
Excellent. Well, we have a viewer question, and I'll pose this to both of you, but we'll start with Meg. So pursuant to generating these concrete solutions or concrete platforms for dialogue and having real conversations about what resiliency entails, we see data privacy and data governance as being sort of a consistent point of friction in these conversations. And we see that being true in the transatlantic relationship, but then also with some of those extended partners and allies. And so Drishya's question is, looking ahead, what concrete steps can be taken to protect transatlantic data flows and digital trade while also promoting the innovation ecosystem across both public and private sectors? So Meg, we'll kick that to you, and then we'll hear from Fran.
Yeah, and I'll say I'm not an expert on data privacy, but I am fairly engaged on cybersecurity, and both as a company because we make security products and are very involved in secure authentication and protection of data. And then as a company, we also have very fierce needs to protect our IP. Which is data. So I think that the thing I can speak to is common and robust cybersecurity policies, principles, best practices, proactive. We have been in this business for a really long time of cybersecurity, and we see there is finally a lot of momentum. And I think that the US-EU TTC working group on cybersecurity and all the various component members of that are leveraging the framework of the US-EU TTC to make some progress. We see it. I see it closely with gatherings of chief information security officers on a weekly basis to discuss protecting data. So I think there is a lot of progress being made, but I can't speak to privacy policy per se. Maybe you can do better at that, Fran.
So I would just say that I think we have taken an important step to protect transatlantic data flows with this new executive order, and presumably with the adequacy opinion that will come from the EU over the next few months. Without that, we were starting already to see localization of data, of personal data in the EU, and pressure to do that. I think that the observation made by Ruth Berry about how localization of Ukrainian government data suddenly became a real instability and a threat was a very good one. And it doesn't matter whether the data is in Europe or the United States, but I mean, it needs to be in places where it can be secure. I agree with everything that Meg said about cybersecurity. This is something that I think we need to be looking at, not just in terms of, government data and critical infrastructure, but even all the way down to devices like my home printer that are on the Internet of Things, and who knows, I could innocently open something and there would be some issues. And I think both the US and the EU are taking steps to look at how to protect even those types of devices, as well as critical infrastructure. I would point to the EU's proposed Data Act as something that we need also to discuss. This is mostly about industrial data. It's not so much about personal data. It has in its current draft, and it's a long way from being finalized yet. It has some restrictions on international data transfers. And I think that is the kind of thing that will very much restrict innovation and research collaboration across the Atlantic. I think, yes, it is perfectly reasonable to restrict data to countries that meet certain IP standards, right? But I think that we can certainly argue that the US has high IP standards. And so I hope that is a topic that the US and the EU will talk about and resolve, because I think we both want the same thing, which is for there to be a very vibrant transatlantic innovation ecosystem.
Excellent. So moving a little bit on to kind of as our final question, how you prioritize a lot of these areas. I mean, there's limited resources, limited people, limited time to really address the wide range of issues in the transatlantic relationship. Our report covered a couple of different areas: artificial intelligence, biotech, quantum, clean energy, ICTS, semiconductors, and standard setting. So a question to both of you: if you're racking and stacking these issues, and Meg, I maybe know how you would answer this, but we'll start with you, Meg, and then Fran, how would you rack and stack these issues? How would you prioritize them? Which are the issues that we need to address immediately and urgently in the relationship?
So from there's just so many things coming at us on a daily basis. I mean, we have the shortages in the industry that we need to resolve as a company, and the CHIPS funds, and the R&D funds, and a lot of RFIs. And I think from the perspective of Washington, one of the most critical elements that the EU and US have to work on together is workforce development to support a high-tech advanced manufacturing industry. It's a really critical factor. All the money in the world for manufacturing facilities will not overcome the shortage of workers to make it happen here. That's the number one, I think, issue. The supply chain resilience, I think there's efforts to be made there, and I think there's solutions there. But workforce is the top one. Multilateral trade agreement on the approach to controls is also going to be very important from both the diplomatic and the industry side. So those are my top topics.
So I would say that rather than trying to identify which is the most important technology, that one should look at this horizontally. And I would say that of the ones that you listed, I would pick standardization or standard setting, because that goes across every single one of the other technologies. We need to learn how to cooperate in doing that and how to make sure that our standards become the global standards. And by that, I mean the US and European standards and others from the democratic world. So we need to make sure that those are the standards, whatever the technology, that becomes the global norm. The other thing that I would point to is that increasingly we're going to have to focus on cybersecurity or resilience across technologies. And if we give it a higher priority, I think we will end up with more technologies that are kind of designed with it in mind, is what I can understand, was what I've understood as a possibility. So I would say, rather than trying to say, oh, it's AI this weekend, oh, next week it's quantum, and oh, next week it's something else. I mean, I'm following AI right now because I think it might be a really interesting case study of how the TTC can bring more convergence between the US and the EU. But that's because it's a case study, not because it's the most important technology right now. Instead, I would say, let's look at these horizontally. How do we deal with standard setting? How do we deal with resilience in whatever new technology is emerging?
Fran, that was such a good reminder to not just chase the shiny object, which I think, everyone, government and not, is certainly guilty of. So a great reminder to think about kind of what those horizontal areas are and those issues that undergird the relationship. Fran, Meg, Hannah and I so appreciate you both joining us today for this discussion. It was a tour de force covering a really wide array of policy issues in the transatlantic tech relationship. The conversation gave me a lot of hope that we're making great strides together, but there are a lot of opportunities and there's a ton of urgency for future cooperation moving forward. So big thank you to both of you. From our session earlier, for Mr. Gerard DeGraff and Deputy Assistant Secretary Ruth Berry, thank you for joining us earlier. And a big thank you to all of you for tuning in. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Bye-bye.